Hey, welcome back to Christmas with Karl. This is episode 18, and we're studying the work of Karl Barth, particularly a chapter called The Miracle of Christmas in Church Dogmatics, Volume 1, Book 2. We're on page 193. The chapter starts on page 172 in the edition I have from Hendricks and Publishers in 2010. We are finishing our discussion on the absence of a father in the birth of Jesus. It's about a 5-page discussion in Karl Barth's chapter, and it's got some really good stuff in it. And so we're not going to skip over it because it's awkward or anything like that. We're human beings, and actually, part of this is destigmatizing talking about sex, and so that's actually a good thing. This 2-page section is something that he says is supplementary. It's not the focal point of his discussion, and it's not like the main argument that he would make. He just includes it because he thinks it has some valuable information. And I think sometimes we do that, right? Like if we're talking about any biblical subject, let's say we're talking about the role of baptism within the conversion of the individual. We may go to Acts 2:38. We might go to Romans chapter 6, and those would be really good passages. But maybe we would go to Naaman washing in the Jordan River as just sort of a supplementary, uh, illustration to describe what happens. And it's not like a main argument. It's not going to convince anybody, but it might be just some useful information we might throw out there just to give somebody something to think about, maybe. If that. Okay, let's look at page 193. We do have a little bitty sentence at the bottom of 192, and then we'll move on. He says, an extension and an elucidation of what has been said, it is not illegitimate to adduce one other consideration at this point regarding a secondary but all the same a necessary question. What is the significance of the fact that in the sign of the agape there is excluded not only the sign of eros as such, but particularly the function of the male? Why is the male excluded? Why does God choose the Virgin Mary instead of a worthy man to bring about the incarnation of Jesus? Our minds wouldn't be able to wrap around how that would even work, but it's worth our consideration, he says. Okay, here we go. He says, underlying the second part of this statement, that is from Hebrews chapter, let's see, where is it here? From Hebrews chapter 7, that Jesus is without father, without mother. He says, but underlying the second part of the statement, which is of interest to us here, is the recognition that when considering the human nature of Christ, that he also exists as a man, not in virtue of a possibility of existence proper to his humanity, but solely in virtue of his divine existence in the eternal mode of being of the Word or Son of God. It's like, remember, this is an act of God. This is something that is divine. This is something that is beyond what we can normally think of when we think of the production of a human being. He says his existence in time is one and the same as his eternal existence as the begotten of God, the Father. So keep in mind that Jesus' Father is not a human, but is actually God the Father. Here's why he thinks this is important. Now, it is precisely the human Father from whom a human Son has to thank for everything that marks his existence as belonging to him, his name above all, and with it his position, his rights, his character as such and such an individual, his place in history. Thus, his begetting by a human Father could not be the sign of the existence of the man Jesus alone as the Son begotten of Father in eternity. This sign would rather describe him as a man whose existence is different from the existence of God and is proper to himself. So if we're able to understand that Jesus is of the same being as God, right, in the Nicene Creed, then he couldn't have had a human father because he would derive all of his qualities from his human father. His name, his prestige, his land, his occupation, his responsibilities, his way in the world, all these sorts of things. And he says, but instead, he comes from God the Father. Now Karl is going to pause because he's introduced a idea that could potentially lead to that sort of reveals a fallen view of humanity that he just has to address. And this is going to last for about a page and a half. So hope you have some fun with this. So he goes on and he says that we certainly have to say that the wife also has a share in this determination of man. So even though you want to, even though that technically the human son derives a lot of this from his father, culturally, the wife does have a say in this determination. And why? He says, for she too is a man. That is, she too is a human. Only a foolish ideology of manhood, he says, or an equally foolish ideology of womanhood can deny her share in this determination of man. Nevertheless, he says, there can be no talk of an equality of the two sexes in this respect. And what he's going to describe here is this is not an inherent inequality, but it is of the fallen nature that has brought this inequality about. He said God alone knows whether the history of humanity, nations and states, art, science, economics, has in fact and is so predominantly the history of males, the story of all the deeds and works of males, as it appears to be. So in other words, it appears that males have dominated, the conversation for the past however many years. He says, but only God knows if that's actually been the case. Or whether, he says, for all that, the hidden factor of female cooperation and participation has not, in fact, always turned the scale in a way of which chronicles, acts, and monuments give us no information, because it involves an element which is deeply concealed both psychologically and sociologically, although it was not and did not need to be less potent for that reason. In other words, women have had just as much to do in history as men. There are just not as many monuments, not as many essays, not as many biographies, not as many histories written about their participation in the flow of human history. Okay, he says, be that as it may. Okay, this is not necessarily how it has to be. He says male action is significant for the world history and characteristic of the world of the world history with which we are acquainted, as it has been and actually is for us, even if it is not so in itself. The biblical witness, he says, though, to Revelation assumes this, and subsequent thought in the Christian church has also taken it over without ado. But it is worthwhile in this respect to see exactly what the starting point of the biblical testimony is. In other words, yes, humanity has put man at the head of everything for a long time. And he says, in the Christian church even just continued this tradition along without even giving it any consideration at all. He says, but if we look at the biblical testimony and get back to where this trend started, it doesn't start in Genesis 1. It starts in Genesis 3. He says, in view of the fateful conversation with the serpent in Genesis 3, 1-6, we might first inquire whether the name of the one human being by whom sin entered the world was not really Eve rather than Adam, but Romans 5:12 and 1 Timothy 2:14 both seem to name Adam, rather specifically Romans 5:12 and 1 Corinthians 15. He says, but according to Genesis 3:16, it is definitely part of the curse imposed on male and female in consequence of the fall that the male becomes Lord of the woman. This would hardly follow from the fact, he says, that according to Genesis 2:18, the woman was made as a helpmeet for the male, rather a helpmeet for the male, and according to Genesis 2:21 and following, was made of the rib of the male. And so Paul, in his allusion to this passage in 1 Corinthians 11:8 and following, could hardly regard this super and subordination as an order of creation, but only, which is a rather different, as a divine ordinance valid in the sphere of the fall. So he's like, so this whole idea, this tangent is just so funny. This whole idea that man is Lord over woman doesn't come from the created order, the order of creation, those umbrellas, it comes from the fall. It comes from Genesis chapter 3. You can't base this doctrine out of Genesis chapters 1 and 2, he says. He says, thus, not because of a original mark of distinction, but because of the common fall of man and woman, in which both step out of relationship, in which there is no word at all of super or subordination, there arises the unlikeness, and man becomes the Lord of woman, and therefore significant for world history. So he's like, the fall is what really brought all this about, where man is over woman. And maybe this is why God didn't use man in bringing about Jesus, because of this trend in world history, despite male and females both how they were both complicit within the fall. So he goes on and he says, so it is the male that is set aside here in the virgin birth. It is he says, countersign, or rather, if a countersign to be set up as the sign of the incarnation of God. This is a countersign against predominant world history, he's arguing. In this sign, the contradiction of grace is directed against the male because he is peculiarly, man, I cannot say that word, peculiarly, there we go, significant for the world history of human genius, what takes place in the mystery of Christmas is not world history and not the work of human genius. And as the sign of this fact, that you may know, the birth of Jesus Christ, in contradiction to the beginning of all other men, is in no sense a history of males. This is not come from a work of the flesh. He goes on and he says, if women demands justification, if woman demands justification and rehabilitation in the face of the significant preeminence of the male for world history, and it is better that she should not, he adds for some reason, let her keep to this sign. If she wants to protest against male's preeminence in world history, focus on the virgin birth, he says, because by its limitation of man and his sin, it means at the same time the limitation of male preeminence. That is, the virgin birth is actually sowing the seed, if you will, no pun intended, that's kind of funny. It's sowing the seed of a new creation in which male preeminence is eliminated and male and female are brought to equality within Jesus Christ as originally intended in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. It's a restoration of what was lost in Adam. He says, his eternal generation, that is Jesus's, his eternal generation of this eternal Son excludes a human generation, because a human father and human generation, the whole action of man the male, can have no meaning here. Therefore, it is the very absence of masculine action that is significant here. Hence, Jesus was born of a virgin. Okay, that brings us to the end of page 194. We're going to pick up one comment from 194 before going into 195, and then we'll be ready to talk about Jesus being conceived of the Spirit. So one more video along these lines where we're focusing on the virgin birth of Jesus, and then we'll get into Jesus being conceived of the Spirit. All right, thank you again for watching. Hope you'll tune into the next video, and happy Advent. This is an Advent series. See you in the next one. Bye.